lesson looking at learning theory of attachment. There are two theories which you're required to know, and we're going to start with learning theory. It doesn't matter which way round you do them, but because we've looked at the study by Harlow, it probably is quite useful to look at learning theory at this point. Okay, so if we just do a quick check of the spec, we've covered these in red at the top. So we should be up to this point, explanations of attachment. So we're going to just look at learning theory here. And because you've already covered learning theory largely for approaches for paper 2, this should be quite easy for you because you've already got most of the basics. So a lot of it should be recapping. You should know a lot of the research, and the main issue here for this lesson is going to be the applying it to attachment. So there are two major approaches basically to explain attachment. Now there are obviously lots of different theories, but there are two that are named here. So we're looking at the sort of how and why an attachment forms. So mainly why. So the first of the two approaches is learning theory by Dollard and Miller. Although you don't necessarily have to quote them, but they're probably the first people who applied it to attachment. We're then going to move on to evolutionary theory by Bowlby, which we are going to spend more time on because I don't think you've looked at evolutionary theory yet. And hopefully I'll be able to teach that to you face to face next week. So learning theory. So first of all, the first thing you need to know about learning theory is the idea that everything is learned. So we are born tabula rasa, which means a blank slate, and we are like a sponge where everything is learned. So therefore, attachment is a set of learned behaviours resulting from the experience of the environment and not innate processes. So this is something that there is nothing biological about this. This is like a kind of mechanism that happens, if you like, through kind of repetition, through association, through consequences. And we learn an attachment through two ways which work together. Now, when I teach this, I usually teach these separately and then put them together. And I think with attachment, the biggest issue really is putting these together, because on their own, it's easy to understand what classical conditioning is, and it's easy to understand what operant conditioning is. But what you need to know is that this is actually a combined process. So these videos you do need to watch, so I'll just click on them so that you're aware of what we're looking at. So first of all, the first video here is a bit of an introduction to classical conditioning, which should be a bit of a recap for you. I'm not going to watch the video now, but it's looking at the work of Ivan Pavlov, and it's basically explaining what you've already looked at for approaches. So that is just about 4 minutes of looking at what classical conditioning is. There isn't anything in that video at all about attachment theory, it's just the basics. So if we go back to this, the second video here, which I would like you to have a look at, this time is, I'll just wait for it to load up here. Might take a little bit longer. Is the piece of research to support that, the human piece of research, which is the study by Little Albert. And you may or may not have watched this clip. Unfortunately, it does have subtitles in it looks like Spanish there. But what I like about this is it is original footage of the study. So already you can see that we've got two pieces of research that are going to back up classical conditioning. We've got the study by Ivan Pavlov and the study by John Watson. So that's just a bit of an explanation of classical conditioning. I will come back in a second to operant conditioning and what that actually entails. So first of all, we're going to start off by looking at classical conditioning. So if you think about when a baby is introduced to food, it's an unconditioned stimulus. It's something that makes the baby happy. But remember, at this point, the baby doesn't particularly understand happy, it just knows that it feels some kind of comfort. So we've got an unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, which leads to an unconditioned response, which is this kind of happiness and this kind of feeling of satisfaction. The mother at this point is a completely neutral stimulus. On her own, she doesn't have an effect at all. So she doesn't evoke any feelings at all or any reaction in that baby. But who feeds the baby? It's the mother. So if you pair the mother and the food, so if we're going to use some terminology, the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, because remember the food produces pleasure. And if we repeat these over and over and over, now that's a natural process. And whilst we'd say this is conditioning, that's a natural process that happens several times a day, every day. And what does that result in? It results in an unconditioned response, which is the baby feeling happy. So the pairing of these two. Now what happens is, because they are paired so much over and over and over, just in the way that Pavlov paired the food with the bell, eventually when you remove the food from the equation and you just have the mum becomes a conditioned stimulus, which then leads to the conditioned response. So the mum on her own evokes feelings of pleasure, of happiness, of satisfaction, and so on. And there we've got a kind of learnt response to an attachment being formed. The baby is attached to the mum through this process. Now, we start off with food, but we can substitute this for nappy changing, for lots of different things. But the point being that the key in all of these is going to be the mother. So we've actually learned a new response. So if we just leave operant for a minute and just have a quick look at this. So the infant learns to associate feeding and comfort with the primary carer, the mother. The mother acquires comforting properties by association. So this is actually quite a powerful thing that the infant doesn't know anything about. The mother doesn't really. But what we're doing is we're basically applying those principles of classical conditioning to explain an attachment behaviour. Now, of course, you're going to question, is this love? Well, we don't know, but it's certainly an attachment that the child is distressed without being there. If we just go back to have a quick look, sorry, excuse me, let me just stop those videos for a second. If we just go back to operant conditioning now, and the video clip there, you should be able to watch. I'll just quickly click on it. You should be quite familiar with some of these video clips, but I've just chosen the one of Skinner, and because it, there we go. So if you want to watch that, and that just gives you a little bit of background to the theory of operant conditioning. Again, I'm not going to watch that now. You can watch that in your own time, and it is something that you should be quite familiar with because you've already covered that. Operant conditioning, if you remember, is learning via consequences. So that's learning via reward and punishment, or withdrawal of reward, or so on. So if we just have a look at this, so basically what happens in terms of operant conditioning is an infant learns that if they cry, it brings a response from an adult. So if they cry, the mum comes, and that's reinforcement. So every time the mum comes to the child crying, there is a reinforcement. Now that's not really a positive kind of reinforcement for the parent, but it is for the child. So what the child starts to learn is if it engages in certain behaviours, such as crying, such as smiling, and so on, it brings certain responses from adults. And that's why when you're looking at trying to condition or teach a baby, you do need to engage in things like control crying, because they are schedules of reinforcement. So the child is, you don't want a child to learn that every time they cry, they are rewarded by the adult attending to them, because they're just going to cry and cry and cry. So therefore, it is quite subtle, the way that this has got to be managed in a lot of ways, and it does sound quite clinical, but it is actually something that you can shape behaviour with. So you can actually shape behaviour here through positive and negative reinforcement. You can reinforce what you want the infant to do by praise and reward and hugs and so on. And so if you ignore the child crying, they're going to learn not to cry. And whilst that's quite harrowing and quite hard, and you can't do that all the time, you can see that basically this is how you can use operant conditioning. Now I need to say that these two, classical and operant conditioning, work together. They do not work separately, because as the mum is feeding the child, she is also providing positive reinforcement. It's also a positive response. And whilst the mum is also changing the nappy of the child, it's also again bringing positive reinforcement. So these two do actually work together. So the predictions of learning theory are that the child will form an attachment based on the person or people who provide the primary care. So they are the people who feed, change the nappies. Forget now about Schaefer and Emerson's stages, because one of the interesting things about learning theory is it could account for multiple attachments, because if that primary care provision is provided by a range of carers, then those attachments can develop, according to this theory, with several people. And therefore the attachment will increase steadily from birth and will become stronger and stronger. And the strongest attachments will be with the people who provide the most primary care. So that's why Harry Harlow was quite interested, because he actually came from a learning theory perspective. He believed that those monkeys were going to develop strong attachments with the monkey, the wire monkey and so on, that provided the food, because that's what he believed the attachment was based on, and that's actually called cupboard love theory. I'd like you to have a look at this, and I will talk about this in the next video. I want you to have a look. It's a very interesting scenario, because it really does require you to understand this theory to actually understand what would happen in terms of this. So we've got this baby who has a nanny. The baby is bottle fed, and most of her feeds are administered by the nanny. The mother works part-time, but the nanny provides the practical care. So basically, according to learning theory, should Cheska's mum be worried? And according to learning theory, basically, yes, she should be, because it's the nanny who is providing the food, basically. Now, question 2, we won't be able to do until we've looked at the next theory. I hope you can understand that, and if you have any queries, please get back to me. And as always, I will go through it and try to help you with that. Thank you, and again, please rewatch if you have any concerns about it, and please check with all your stuff in the booklet and in the Tutor2You pack.